Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. In our last episode, we explored the controversial and somewhat contentious semi-mythical origin story of Kilwa, when Ali ibn Hassan al-Shirazi, a Persian prince born from a nobleman from Shiraz and an enslaved African woman, sailed to the island of Kilwa and created a new kingdom of his own. While the exact historicity of the account remains contentious, we examined the evidence, and determined that there was at least some basis to this story based on genetic evidence, and that Persian sailors likely did play a somewhat unclear but notable role in the early history of the city. However, we also determined that the archaeological evidence and the remainder of Kilwa's history confirms its status as a civilization with an African foundation, just one which happened to have a transoceanic cosmopolitan bent. In today's episode, we'll see how the Kilwa Chronicle will illustrate the next chapter of Kilwa's history, its rise as an early economic power in East Africa. Season 6, Episode 6, Lime, Iron, and Salt. Regardless of the exact historicity of the Kilwa Chronicle, the undeniable reality is that it is our most comprehensive source on early Kilwa history, and one which we will, for better or for worse, have to rely on extensively. This is pretty similar to our reliance on the Tantara Niandriana the Antananarifu during our season on Madagascar. It's a useful source, but one which you need to be careful with and that you can't take as gospel. And while the document may have its flaws, as we'll see, there is some corroborating evidence for its historicity in other sections that mean that, despite its flaws, it is something that is very much worth our consideration. This starts with the historicity of the first documented king of Kilwa. In our last episode, while I expressed skepticism towards many of the details of his life in the Chronicle, I also noted that Ali Shirazi was definitely a real historical figure. We can say that with certainty due to an archaeological find on the island, a small hoard of early buried coins, among which we find 30 silver pieces from the late 10th century, inscribed with the name Ali ibn Hassan, or Arabic for Ali, son of Hassan. The existence of these coins acts as very strong evidence that Ali of Shiraz was a real historical figure, though again, his exact biography is largely unknown to us with any degree of certainty. Even the Chronicle, though, gives us shockingly little to work with while fleshing out his character. For a figure who is so consequential to Kilwa's history, he doesn't really shine through in terms of a notable personality or any sort of individual achievement. After his establishment of Kilwa, the only details that the document gives us is that his rule lasted a pretty long time. He had multiple sons both before and after arriving in Kilwa, and that he led Kilwa's first off-island conquest, an idea which we'll discuss in greater detail soon. Instead of relying on the text, it seems like the early rise of Kilwa is something that we're largely going to have to piece together ourselves with archaeology. And when it comes to the archaeology on Kilwa Island, something undeniably started to change dramatically around the end of the 10th century. For reasons which are still not totally clear, the city's archaeological record points to a gradual but noticeable rise in international trade goods around this time. Suddenly, the once almost universally local poverty is joined by sprinkles of exotic varieties. Notable quantities of glass and ceramics, notably from the Middle East, but in the early years of the 11th century, they were joined by goods from much further afield. Fragments have been uncovered in the early 11th century from, get this, porcelain pottery from Song Dynasty China. Of course, we know from a study of the island's geography that it was a perfect candidate as a global trade hub, but, well, its growth had been slow before then. Why, in the 10th century, did it start now? While the answer to this question might not lie in the far-off lands where these foreign luxuries originated, but rather in another part of Africa, just south of Kilwa itself, down the coast towards modern-day Mozambique and Zimbabwe. See, Kilwa's rise also just happens to coincide with another major development, one which would completely transform the future of business and commerce on the East African coast. The exact details of this process are still somewhat up for debate and speculation, and honestly deserve their entire own season. However, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries AD, contemporaneous to Kilwa's rise, the Zambezi and Limpopo River valleys were undergoing an immense social transformation. The region, which had once been dominated by small settlements of rural farmers linked by semi-nomadic cattle herders, began to coalesce into large organized settlements, and eventually into properly formed, complex city-states. The region was soon sprinkled with and then dominated by socially complex, urbanized society. Again, future season material, wink wink. These urbanized civilizations, such as Mapungubwe in South Africa and Great Zimbabwe in, began to, for the first time, exploit the region's substantial gold deposits, mining the precious metal at a torrid pace and exporting them for foreign consumption down the river, where they were then sold to international merchants on the coast. The enormous quantities of gold being now offered near the Zambezi estuary and its surroundings began to dramatically shift the geography of trade in East Africa. The southern section of the East African coast, once a mere afterthought to Indian Ocean merchants, became one of the most significant ports of call for merchants trading in gold. The region's main entrepot was a location known as Sofala. Now, there's a reason why I said location instead of port or city, because according to several archaeological surveys, Sofala was not exactly a city in the traditional sense, but more like an embodiment of the oxymoronic idea of a permanent, temporary entrepot. Basically, the settlement was just an oversized market with the occasional residents, but where the vast majority of the population was pretty much always coming and going. Sofala was basically an incredibly lucrative tent city, a place with few native residents, filled to the brim with foreign merchants both from up the river and across the sea. Now, as we'll discuss in more detail in a later episode, João de Barros, the same Portuguese writer who recorded the Kilwa Chronicle, will make a really interesting claim about Sofala, that it was originally settled by Somalis, interested in acting as middlemen in the gold trade, who kept the location of Sofala a closely guarded secret from the outside world, including the Swahili of Kilwa. This claim is debatable at best, to be honest, and the sudden influx of foreign imports, not only in Kilwa but across much of the East African coastline, indicates that regardless of how obscure or well-known Sofala may have been, that the broader world was once again taking a deep interest in trade in East Africa. By the same token, Kilwa, once a harbor positioned awkwardly between what a merchant would see as the precious Red Sea shipping lanes and, nothing of value, was now positioned between those still precious shipping lanes and the Indian Ocean's premier gold source. At the same time that the quantity of foreign goods in Kilwa was exploding, so too did the architectural tenor of the island shift as well. Around 980 AD, on an island still exclusively dotted with small, square, earthen and quarried stone houses, a new type of building emerged. Little remains of the structure today, and we can't even be entirely sure what it even was. But today, there still remains on Kilwa Island a simple, circular foundation about 5 meters in diameter, buried underneath the ruin of a building a few centuries younger. What makes this little cylindrical base important, though, is what it was built out of. Rather than quarried stone, it was made out of a unique type of petrified, Portuguese coral limestone. This type of coral was, and still is, abundant in the area surrounding Kilwa, and so the region contained unusually plentiful limestone deposits. In a region with few nearby inland quarries, it makes use of this shoreline stone would soon become a useful building material, and indeed it would throughout many Swahili settlements along the coast. But in Kilwa, this trend would be taken to a wholly new level. Rather than an isolated structure, while it's far from anything impressive compared to the much greater ruins of later centuries on the island, this little cylindrical base represented the future of Kilwa's architecture in the making, as nearly all of the city's surviving ruins, including those that overshadow it, would be constructed from this unique material. Even in the buildings that weren't directly made from the substance, coral limestone still played an important role in construction. At the same time that the first coral limestone buildings were appearing, we also find our first evidence of the usage of the material in the local production of lime. Lime, not to be confused with the supposedly tasty green fruit, is a chemical material which can be extracted by the heating of limestone in a kiln to extreme temperatures. And it is incredibly useful in a vast array of diverse applications. From the creation of different types of cements and mortars, as a plaster to cover a surface on a building, as a sealing agent to waterproof a building's interior, and much, much more. At Kilwa, lime was cooked in great quantities, far greater than what we estimate would have been needed for its own use in construction, likely indicating that the island was a major exporter of the substance. Their most likely customers would have been societies of inland Tanzania and Malawi. Over there, archaeological evidence shows the use of lime for the waterproofing of homes, despite a notable lack of locally accessible limestone deposits. This is likely a sign that people from these regions were purchasing their lime from the Swahili coast and, most likely, from Kilwa. In addition to the production of lime and the wealth acquired from acting as a middleman in foreign trade, in the late 10th century, Kilwa was also experiencing a major expansion in iron and copper metallurgy, as well as the growing production of salt by boiling seawater. Each of these products were incredibly valuable to people in the interior regions of East Africa, and could be exchanged for impressive sums of goods from those regions. Ivory, hides, precious metals and stones, tropical wood, and much, much more came from this exchange, which could then be resold for an even greater profit to Arab, Indian, Persian, Indonesian, and Somali merchants. The once easily ignored port of Kilwa was starting to become a must-stop site for anyone interested in striking it rich on the Indian Ocean. The presence of those local coins I mentioned earlier are another indication of the island's growing wealth as a trade hub. While minting coins is a very common practice today, done by pretty much every sovereign state on planet Earth, the practice is much more rare historically than you might expect, especially in Africa. This is because the conditions where minting coins is advantageous and worth the sometimes substantial cost are a lot more specific than you might think. For coin minting to be worth it, a few things must be true. Precious metals must be abundant enough that the state can acquire them in decent quantities, but they also need to be rare enough that they hold value. For example, we saw in much of West Africa, including the Ashanti Empire, that gold was simply too abundant and therefore not used as a primary currency. It must also be a region with an active enough mercantile economy that the ease of exchange facilitated by coinage outweighed the cost of minting, but that also doesn't have a ready enough supply of foreign coinage to make local coinage redundant. For example, we saw in our season on Madagascar that these two factors played a big role. Madagascar's mercantile economy was too weak for centuries to make coinage worth it, while by the time it got strong enough to support such a system, it was already flooded with far more abundant foreign coins. And so, it was quite unusual that by the late 10th century, the rapid growth of the complexity of Kilwa's economy had started the kingdom in minting coins. These coins were the first of their kind minted in East Africa since the fall of the Empire of Aksum, with the exception of some debatable gold coins from southern Madagascar and a few from Somalia notwithstanding. These coins were minted of copper and silver initially, and featured inscriptions in Arabic, the language of religion and prestige throughout much of the Indian Ocean. However, later generations of Kilwa's leaders would also begin minting in gold, a major sign of prestige at the time when still only a handful of countries could afford to do so. Of course, the growing wealth of Kilwa at this time was also likely what enabled the island to begin its first round of expansion. According to both versions of the chronicle, the first target of Kilwa's expansion was another nearby island, named Munafisa in Arabic and Munfia in Portuguese. This island is widely assumed to be Mafia Island, located about 200 miles north of Kilwa. The chronicle states that the Sultan of Kilwa, Ali ibn Hassan, ordered for the island to be captured, and successfully brought it under Kilwa's domination before appointing his infant son as its de jure regent. Like much of the early chronicle, it's hard to say how much of the story reflects historical reality, but in this case, the archaeological record on Mafia seems to align with the chronicle's timeline. During the late 10th century, the same time that the invasion purportedly occurred, the style of pottery on Mafia shifted substantially, away from the traditional qualeware style that had dominated the island beforehand, and instead replaced with a variation of triangle incised ware, the style made in Kilwa and associated with Swahili cultural dispersion. Mafia, at the time of its domination, was also experiencing a degree of urban growth similar to Kilwa, with the island's first coral limestone buildings being constructed at a site called Kisimani Mafia in the late 10th or early 11th century. Much like Kilwa itself, the area appears to have been a major site for the manufacturing of lime and iron, though the exact way that this relates to the conquest by Kilwa is, I'm getting tired of saying this, but it wasn't exactly super clear. It's plausible that the site was already a growing urban center before Kilwa arrived, serving as an early competitor and rival to Kilwa's trade in lime and iron. This may have even been the motive behind the island's conquest, for Kilwa to gain control over its rising competitor. However, it could have just as easily been the opposite, that the urban center of Kisimani Mafia represented a colony established by Kilwa, and that the island grew rapidly as a consequence of Kilwa setting up those very same lime and iron processing centers. Due to the roughly contemporaneous explosion of triangle incised ware on the island, I would personally lean towards the latter theory myself, but again, they're both plausible. While we know very little about the course of the expedition itself, the fact that Kilwa's leaders were able to take control of Mafia Island also tells us a great deal about the state of Kilwa as a political power. Kilwa was not only able to expand and exert its political will on a foreign land, but also able to do so over a fairly long maritime distance. This is a sign that even from this early age, Kilwa was not only a passive maritime port of call, but an active maritime power as well, projecting its power over the sea. Kilwa and other Swahili states of this time period used a unique type of ship. They are identified as mtepe, the generic Kiswahili word for boat, but used in other languages to refer to a specific type of medieval Swahili vessel. Much like we discussed in our episode on Rapta, the boats of East Africa were primarily assembled in a way that didn't require metal nails or pegs, but rather relied on a complex combination of coconut fiber fastenings and wooden joint bindings. The refusal to use metal nails is interesting, especially for a city known for its production of iron, like Kilwa. However, while iron was abundant in Kilwa, it was also an incredibly valuable trade good, so it makes sense that Kilwa and other Swahili states nearby would have had an aversion to using it as something as simple as a ship nail. After all, in a region where iron was often just as valuable as gold, doing so would kind of be like assembling a ship out of golden nails. Unfortunately, though, this fascinating method of ship construction, while effective during the ship's period of use, just so happened to be a terrible curse for their preservation. Unlike ships built with nails, which can often be preserved long after sinking, even for centuries in a fairly intact state, shipwrecked Mtepe saw their coconut fiber bonds disintegrate years after sinking. As we discussed in our season on Aksum, an empire which similarly used woven shipbuilding techniques, shipwrecks from woven vessels often resemble more of a scattered collection of planks with cargo. However, unlike in the case of Aksum, we do actually have a pretty decent idea of what Kilwa's ships look like. For starters, unlike with Aksum, there is a continuous tradition of Swahili shipbuilding techniques that extended into the relatively recent past and even into the early 20th century. We can compare this later tradition to small illustrations found on structures from later Kilwa periods. While these might only represent the scale of Kilwa's boats in later ages, the illustrations seem to indicate that even during the medieval period, Kilwa's ships represented large constructions, similar in shape and design to the Mtepe of later periods. They featured a long, protruding bow in the shape of a crescent, a disproportionately large sail, a large visible rudder, and a small cabin made of thatch on the ship's main body. These features are all plainly visible on graffiti carved into Kilwa's building, with the exception of that thatch cabin, which might have been a later innovation. But the fact that Kilwa was able to exert force on an island such a long distance away additionally shows us that even from this early time, the island was quickly becoming a budding thalassocracy. However, despite this early rise, the history of Kilwa would not be one of uninterrupted dominance. Even very early in the country's history, a major nearby enemy will make themselves known and bring Kilwa to its knees. Join us in our next episode as a foreign country conquers the island of Kilwa for the first time, and the destiny of this rising maritime empire is brought into question. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Omokocha, Gio Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Firgiani, Kitty, Mac T, Kelvin D. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Suison Blair, and Yannick Bolnet, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really means a lot.